We ask for discernment as we make decisions on behalf of people. We ask that you help us do our work with justice, kindness, and walk humbly in your name.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, would you please lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you all. Chairman Andrews, would you please come forward and give us a brief presentation of House Bill 324 and especially your amendment, if you would, please.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 324 is a bill that makes the 4 elected statewide agencies have, at will. Currently, the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and the governor's office all have at-will employees. But the other 4 that have an elected executive are under the statewide employment system, and this creates a few issues where it's hard for people who get elected to serve a particular purpose to come in and make that change, because they can't even necessarily shuffle around employees into different positions to put manpower where they need it. So this is a simple bill that simply takes the language that governs our legislative service office and their employment issues and applies it to the 4 statewide electeds. And so that's the bill. The amendment deals with the resources that it takes to do that. So essentially, we transfer 2 full-time positions, and the amount of money associated with that is $236,720. We transfer that from A&I to the Office of the State Auditor to handle the employment issues for those agencies that mostly consisted of unfilled positions from A&I and reflects the fact that it reduces their workload and puts more workload on these agencies.
Okay. Any questions for the bringer? All right, I have a question. So we have some associated costs in this year of about $50,000, and then we have the salaries going forward, which would have been in A&I. Is that a correct statement?
Correct.
Okay, so the real hit to the general fund would be this $50,000. I have a question about timing. So we're going to move these 2 employees immediately, I would assume. And then it's going to take time to hire AWEX, and currently we have FTEs in these departments, these 4 electeds have working for them. And over time, I assume we're going to move over towards AWEX, because this bill allows that flexibility. Is that an accurate statement, or is that what you understand?
Mr. Chairman, I might defer to the agencies
Please.
on how they
Yep.
plan to
Thank
handle
you.
that.
Madam Auditor, thank you for being here. We appreciate you answering my question.
Mr. Chairman, Christy Racina, State Auditor. I think the question so at-will employees will still be FTEs. FTEs can come in 2 classes, either the at-will or protected. The AWAC or at-will employee contractor is sort of a different category altogether. So these are still FTEs, but they'll just be classified as at-will.
So, Madam Auditor, what would be the impact to those employees that you are currently in your office and the other top 4 electeds?
Mr. Chairman, as the bill is currently written, employees that are currently in a protected position would be essentially grandfathered under this bill. This would only impact employees that are hired, promoted, or change positions as of July 1st.
Okay. All right. Does anyone else have a question for the auditor? Go ahead, Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Auditor Racines, thank you for joining us today. It was kind of fun. I was looking out and go, wow, this is cool. This is a 7:30 in the morning meeting, and we get for the top 5. Must be a bill that pertains to them. So if in the situation where in the different offices, let's say there's a position that is non-filled or a branch in the office that is not seeing the workload of another branch, this is where you could say, hey, we definitely need more help in this area. We're going to take a person from this direction and put it in this direction. Or we got an open position that hasn't been filled here. We're going to now fill it over here and have that shuffle ability. That's, as I've read it, that's what this is for, correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Haroldson. Exactly. I think the main thrust behind this bill is to provide flexibility, which currently I don't want to say we don't have any, but it's very difficult to move positions around. It's particularly difficult to reward good state employees. And something I said in the original committee that I think I'll repeat here, these offices are already at a little bit of a disability in hiring folks because the general populace is a little hesitant to come and work for an elected official. Other state employees are hesitant to come and work for an elected official, even though these jobs are actually pretty stable and most of them don't turn over, even with a change in the elected official. There's very much an aura of uncertainty in working in an elected official's office. So whatever flexibility we have to try to attract and retain employees is real valuable. But to your point, if I want to turn 2 employees into 1 or take 1 high and paid employee and turn them into 2 when that position goes vacant, that now is loads of paperwork and time and potentially a trip to this committee to approve that.
Follow up?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just one more follow-up. So you said take a high paid and go to 2 lower paid. So our FTEs aren't solidly set? So let's just say we've got 75 FTEs. We're not set at 75 FTEs. This would give you the ability to branch into 80 FTEs or, but as long as our price points were the same, could you just expand on that, please?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Haroldson, I probably misspoke a little bit, but that brings up a very good point. We're all seeking some flexibility, or at least that's my main thrust, is to say, you know how much money you're giving me, and I get to do that, work that around with positions and tasks, and then I'm accountable to, of course, the legislature and the voters. This bill lays the groundwork for that. It does not solve the issue of flexibility with positions. Those are still designated in the budget bill, which we are held to. Additionally, we are subject to that flat salary provision, and also we're restricted from moving money in between divisions. So this lays the groundwork, but it doesn't get us there. But this is a important first step to be able to have that, both that flexibility, but then also being held to that higher level of accountability.
Okay. Further questions? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Madam Auditor, and whoever wants to take this one. Are these, so if we move forward and then we have exempt employees, do they still have access to the state retirement plan? Okay.
So the answer was yes. Okay. All right. Thank you, Madam Auditor. Mr. Treasurer, would you like to opine on this? Please be brief, and Madam Superintendent, if you'd like to come forward, if there's anything you'd like to add, we'd love to hear from you, and we welcome you all to Appropriations, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah, I would hope that the job classification and the personnel rules and those things were really important to our group, because it took us 14 months to onboard our COO, and that was because of the I guess the slow walking of the job descriptions and being able to actually post the position when it was posted, it was under the wrong classification or description. We told them that, but they would not change it. The only way we got to change was go to the Joint Appropriations Committee after we got the wrong people coming in the door to hire. And they told these folks, well, get it straightened out. They did it in 10 days. But that was in basically November, and the money was available July 1. So we could have had that job, had they done it right the first time, would have been able to post it on about July 15th. So this would get rid of, if there was any delay or anything, it would be on the state official, not the governor's office.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for the treasurer? Seeing none, go ahead, Representative Pendergraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A football analogy, if you will. When an organization decides to hire a new head coach, he comes in and he often brings a certain number of staff with him. I guess my question is, for example, in your agency, how many would that need to be in order to change the direction of a particular agency?
Mr. Treasurer?
I would say in our circumstances that we had to add about 6 or 7 more accountants, and we had to get rid of 6 accountants that necessarily didn't have the qualifications. And that process of making sure that the employees' rights are looked after takes anywhere from 6 to 9 months, because you have to make sure that you're given the educational opportunities to step up and be able to show that they can complete the job. And then after that, then you're hoping they understand that, well, they need to find a job that they're more suited for. And a lot of folks would at that time just go ahead and say, okay, well, I'm going to retire if I can retire. So it could be all of them, basically almost all of them in my circumstance that were there in that division. Didn't have any trouble in the investment division. So I think what I'm trying to say is that it's probably variable due to circumstances. Ballpark figure of what I would look at, you need to have continuity between one elected official and another elected official. I would not necessarily like to have everybody at will, because somebody could go in, wipe out the entire investment team, wipe out the entire accounting team, put their buddies in there, and their buddies may not know anything about what's being done. So I would try to, I think, give some protection to both my investment team and our accounting team, which are really, really essential to the state, but not necessarily the same. I think there's some areas where we can say objectively a person should probably walk down the road, and that's if we have a lot of findings due to their work in the accounting system, or if they're not able to beat their benchmarks in the other system. So I'd seek to develop, some logical, objective benchmarks that if they were not met, then it would be more like an at-will contract rather than completely at-will. The 2 at-will people basically I have is my one policy person and my deputy. Those are the only 2 positions that I have that are totally at-will. So what we try to do is get professionals in there, and we're going to try to figure out some way that we can define, very objective reasons for these people, for either me or my successor to, understand that there are standards that if they're met, then, you can't put your buddy in that seat.
Any further questions for the treasurer? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Treasurer.
Thank you.
Appreciate your comments. Mr. Secretary, would you like to come forward and respond? In the meantime, Madam Superintendent, please opine. We'll try to keep the comments brief so we can get on to other work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Megan Dagenfelder, State Superintendent of Public Instruction. As many of you know, I come into this position straight from the oil and gas business. And so as we look to be accountable to our voters and really operate government more like a business, I think that this is a step in the right direction to do that. Again, would echo the comments that this begins July of 2025 for new hires. And the fact that this doesn't change into AWEC positions, still fully benefited positions. These are FTEs, but just are simply at will. I think that number one provides accountability to our voters and our mission of which we've been elected to this office. And then two, creates a lot of efficiency. My agency, we have over 130 positions. And so when it comes time to hire, when it comes time to working through HRD rules, can become very burdensome and time consuming. This would free us up from those HRD and personnel rules of the state, be able to create our own, be more efficient as agencies, and thus be able to deliver more to voters.
Thank you. Questions for the superintendent? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you. And again, thank you all for being here with us today. It is exciting. If I understand, we have sort of two options in front of us in terms of still having an HR person that you would have access to. I guess this is a question for all of you here. Is there a preference of creating a new HR person within your agency or pulling existing HR persons out of A&I into your agency?
Superintendent?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sherwood, so we discussed this, several of us, of what would make the most sense. And so not wanting to create new positions, look at unfilled positions at the Department of A&I. Also recognizing that our agencies are varying sizes. Again, my agency is over 130 individuals. And so the ability to share those HR folks and house those within the auditor's office. The auditor's office made the most sense because they are in charge of payroll, but have those individuals that are hired jointly with representatives from all four offices.
Madam Auditor, would you like to opine on that?
Mr. Chairman, I would agree. I would also note I'm not sure where the $50,000 that you mentioned early on came from. That may have been from a fiscal note contemplated prior to the amendment that moves money from A&I. So I don't want to speak for that fiscal note because it wasn't mine, but I believe with the current amendment that dollar amount maybe isn't a thing.
Madam
anymore.
Auditor, thank you for that clarity. That's helpful. Thank you. Okay. Any further questions for the superintendent? Mr. Secretary?
Thank you.
Briefly, please, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My main comments are in respect to the issue that Representative Sherwood just brought up, which is the subject of the amendment. I think in my transition, I actually did talk a lot of verbally with our predecessors in this office and got some oral history and institutional history on this. What my understanding is on these statewide electeds that they were largely, the HR was done internally until the A&I centralization happened, which I believe was 2018, certainly was in the legislature and remember that. And I did not realize this as a member at the time. I was all for centralization, but I think that the statewides got caught up in that. And that's one policy choice that I think was unfortunate. And it went away from their offices towards A&I centralization. And my preference strongly, at least for my agency, would be that we do the HR within the agency. We still have an HR liaison who basically does the HR functions largely within the agency anyway. I wouldn't need a new position. In my agency, I could absorb this within our fiscal lead, which has historically maintained the HR duties as the liaison that previously they had. And so I'd appreciate if the body would consider some sort of carve out. I have a lot of respect for the auditor, but to me, it's pretty tenuous saying that because they run payroll, they should be the ones running our HR. And I just think, I understand that whatever, that made some sense. But for our agency, I think that if we're going to do this, I'd like to just go back to the old way. And I don't need any new positions to do it.
Any questions for the secretary? I have a question for you, and then I'll get to you, Mr. Treasurer. So do you think that this bill is written and amended with this amendment would preclude you from being able to do what you just suggested?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question, and I did read the amendment closely. I don't know. I think it appears to suggest that the auditor is going to run the HR and that we can still have a liaison within our agency, but the auditor is going to be basically what A&I has become, which is the thoroughfare for classification decisions, things like that. And so that's the way I read it. And I think that, you could have a sentence clarifying that. I'm fine if they're there, but I just want to clarify that an agency can opt out, or that the agency would be the one that would, and I wasn't privy to the amendment. So the amendment got tacked on here in committee.
So if I may suggest maybe a floor amendment to that effect.
Okay.
And Mr. Treasurer?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, when that consolidation happened, we also had a liaison, but she retired. And so we had to kind of take that internally, and the deputy did quite a little bit of that. And we've been trying to find some person within our office that could actually, kind of alleviate that from the deputy's shoulders. But really haven't found anybody. I think that the secretary makes a good point that if he still has that person that was there, to basically allow that person to have, I guess the ability to continue operating as they are, and to I think that there isn't any problems with the liaison doing exactly what they're doing, because I think it's clear that each official has all of these new imbued powers to their office. So that would just work through the liaison, who would essentially be an HR person that would do those things. I think the things that I think we're all trying to get together and work together and keep this as reasonable as we can. I think it's fine where the auditors do it. I believe that we're going to be able to ask the people in the auditor's office to do our direct bidding without interference from the auditor's office. But if that's unclear, then it probably should be cleared up.
Okay. Well, I think that's why I'm reticent to amend the bill at this point. We need to have those conversations, and that hopefully there'll be time before we get to the floor debate. Thank you. Madam Superintendent.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I would just want to clarify that the intent is that, again, that those positions would be hired jointly by the offices and would not report to the auditor, but rather to the offices. I would also note that I have over 130 positions in my agency. I don't have an HR liaison. And so, the whole thought in this was that, again, that we don't just grow government to the fact that we don't need that. And so recognizing, again, that some of the other offices are much smaller and could in fact share. I'm okay with whatever option we go, just knowing that with the size of my agency, would need an individual. So thank you.
Thank you, Madam Superintendent. And that's our goal too, is to give you guys that flexibility. So try to do this very carefully as we go forward. All right, thank you very much. We really appreciate you being here. This is awesome. I just want to get public comment, Mr. Secretary, and I think you're going to be up again, so you can comment later. Thank you very much. Is there any public comment in the room? Anyone who'd like to comment on this bill? All right, Ms. Childress, do we have anyone online for this bill? All right, so we're going to close public comment at this time. Committee, what's your pleasure? Move the bill, seconded by Representative Haroldson. Okay. Page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. Any discussion on the bill? Representative Sherwood?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will make a motion to include the amendment that was presented to us by Chairman Andrew into the bill.
Chairman Andrew, just a quick question. Has this amendment already been passed by your committee as a committee amendment for the Committee of the Whole?
Yes, it has.
Okay, thank you. All right. Yeah. Any further discussion on the bill? Seeing none, Ms. Childress, would you please take the roll?
Roll call vote, House Bill 324 do pass. Representative Alaman excused. Representative Angelos.
Aye.
Representative Haroldson.
Aye.
Representative Pendergraft.
Aye.
Representative Sherwood.
Aye.
Representative Smith.
Aye.
Chairman Bear?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, 6 aye, 1 excused.
Thank you. That bill passes. Now we'll move on to House Bill 228. Representative and Chairman Knapp, would you please come forward and present the bill? Welcome to House Appropriations. We consider this the best committee in the House. Maybe the Senate too.
Mr. Chairman, committee, thank you. I don't know how to follow up with the 4 electeds. I asked 4 ex-presidents to come, but they must have got stuck in traffic.
We have a tough show to follow around here.
Committee, this bill, House Bill 228, is a prohibition on private funds for conducting elections, sometimes referred to as a Zuckbuck bill. This bill came from last session as well, where it was unceremoniously tabled in committee. I would note that we actually have, as one of the co-sponsors, the person that tabled that, so lots of support for the bill. This bill basically covers prohibiting government officials and election officials from accepting private donations to conduct an election. It also prohibits, on the opposite end, a private citizen from doing the same, contributing funds to an election for those purposes. This basically came out of COVID, and the reason they refer to it as the Zuckerbuck's bill is a small nonprofit that had previously dealt with maybe $3 million was injected with $350 million from a private individual. Those funds found their ways to the states which elections were crucial, the states such as Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona. And basically, the original intent supposedly was for COVID gear supplies. Actually, out of the $350 million, only $1.3 million was actually paid for COVID supplies. The rest went into efforts to solicit votes, to manage personnel and property, to implement drop boxes in areas where actually drop boxes were illegal. And so this basically goes towards preventing that from happening in Wyoming. Oftentimes we hear the phrase, "this doesn't happen here." That's not what our election laws are for. Our election laws are for preventing those things from happening here, rather than working with it in the aftermath. So with that, I would take questions from the committee.
All right, thank you, Chairman Knapp. Is there any questions for the bringer of the bill? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Knapp. I am assuming that I know the answer, but you know what happens when you assume, so I will ask it. Does this bill, the way that it's worded, prohibit, say, a nonprofit from inviting a clerk to a farmer's market to set up an information booth? In terms of, you know, the clerk being there for voter outreach and engagement to answer questions about how you register? Is that considered a sharing or transfer of property, of space? I just want to make sure that we can still allow the clerk to do voter outreach at community events. Thank you.
Chairman Knapp.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sherwood, on page 2, starting on line 11, this does include not applying to meals or food provided or donated in support of election training or education, or meals or food provided on election day to poll workers and other election staff. So I would assume your example would be allowed under this law. I would note this is also not applicable to special district elections where you do have private money actually sometimes being used for a special district election.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any further discussion, questions? Thank you. Appreciate your presentation. We'll start with agencies. Mr. Secretary, did you care to opine on this? And I'll give you the latitude to make a comment on the last bill. I know we were based on time. If you want to start with a brief comment about that, I'll accept that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to clarify, the treasurer had mentioned that I maintained the old liaison. The old liaison is no longer at the office, but we promoted somebody who had that institutional knowledge. So I just wanted to clarify that for the record.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Chuck Gray, the Wyoming Secretary of State, and I stand in support of House Bill 228, prohibiting private funds for conducting elections. In recent years, there has been an increasing and nationwide concern when it comes to private groups funding election administration. This began with private groups funneling over $400 million to election offices in 47 states, citing COVID-19. However, many of these grants went toward massive electioneering efforts, which had nothing to do with COVID-19. Many grants contain the divulgence of election operations, and large discrepancies remain with where funds actually went. This continued into subsequent elections, with many more millions being funneled to election offices around the country to fund election administration, making many grants contingent on best practices and improvement plans to change election administration. These funding models are becoming quite complex and have targeted states like Utah. The source of funding for these new efforts range and include potentially foreign actors who, as foreign nationals, are otherwise prohibited from donating to elections by creating a conduit whereby the organizations they control pump hundreds of millions of dollars to advance a partisan agenda and fund these groups seeking to influence election administration. In response, 28 states have banned or restricted private funding of elections, and many have repudiated private funding of election administration. Given the tactics used by these groups, I've sent numerous letters to the county clerks warning them of Wyoming's vulnerability as one of a minority of states with no ban on private funding of elections, and have urged them not to engage with any of these groups. I'm also very concerned about the potential for foreign funding and these groups being used as conduits for foreign funding, especially because one of the donors that appeared to use these groups as conduits for foreign funding does reside in Wyoming, although he is a foreign national. Now, although the media has tried to say, as they often do, that quote unquote, this doesn't happen in Wyoming, I was deeply disturbed that the Center for Tech and Civic Life, one of the main private organizations causing concern about the private funding of election administration across the country, had a presence at the Wyoming Association of County Officers meeting in Rock Springs on September 25th, 2024. They had a table there and were handing out, literature, and it appeared they were handing out swag and things like that. And I asked our county clerks not to engage with these groups, and it does appear that we are being targeted, especially because we're one of the few rural states without one of these bans on zuckbucks. Now, as opposed to the House Bill 47 from 2023, which was the Joint Corporations Committee bill version of this bill, that only created a prohibition on the solicitation or acceptance of private funds, but no real means by which to prohibit the offering, to give, or giving of private funds by these groups that are causing concern, which was a little bit of a problem not to have that in there. But this bill does account for that to make it so that the offering, to give, or giving, rather than just receiving or soliciting, is a violation. And we did take this up in the 23 interim and proposed it to Corporations Committee, but unfortunately that bill was tabled. But here we are in 2025, and we've got another vehicle in front of us, and I respectfully ask that the committee forward House Bill 228 so that we take a strong stand on prohibiting private funding for conducting elections.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, any questions for Mr. Secretary? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us this morning. I think that at the high level, what you just described is something that we should all be concerned with. What I'm trying to do is read literally how this will be impacted or put into practice on the ground. So I'll ask the same question with a different example. In terms of, I'm thinking of like an in-kind use of shared space at a community event. So for example, September 6th is Louisa Swain Day. And so in our community, we have an event at a local museum where we celebrate Louisa Swain's vote, the first woman to vote in Wyoming. It's super fun. And at that event, this is a museum that is run with nonprofit dollars. The county clerks are invited to set up a booth with voter information. So I just want to make sure that the way that this is currently worded, that we're not dissuading our county clerks from showing up to community events like that to do voter outreach. So whether it's Farmers Market, Freedom Has a Birthday, Louisa Swain Day, I just want to make sure that this is not limiting that in-kind exchange of space and allowing our clerks to go out into the community and engage our constituents.
Mr. Secretary?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to work with you on discussing amendments, but the issue here is that while the example you give is, a group that maybe is a group that does, have a motive that is pure, how do you exclude groups that do not when they're donating space? And that sounds like a great, use and everything there sounds like pure motives, but how do you build an amendment that excludes, Hans Jörg Wyss funded group that has a certain political partisan motive in mind? That's the issue, and so that's the question, and it's a policy choice.
Follow-up? I have a follow-up for you, Mr. Secretary. So this discussion has gone down, quite a path, and I just want a clear clarification from you that you consider, such examples of where they're out there registering voters or accepting these funds to install drop boxes, that you consider that conducting elections, because this is very specific language that says conduct elections. So these funds are prohibited from conducting elections. So are those other activities part of conducting election from your interpretation?
Well, Mr. Chairman, it says including but not limited to voter education, voter outreach, or voter registration programs. I do want it to be very clear that this is about conducting elections. I don't want it to be about policy related to elections, and some of the, like legal expenses, especially at the administrative level. I think that's a little bit of a different issue. But, the challenge is, there's how do you exclude the good stuff without including the bad stuff? And, you can't just say if it feels right, it's going to be allowed, and if it doesn't feel right, it's not going to be allowed, So that's the challenge in trying to get this draft right. I can tell you 28 states have done this, and they're almost every single red state in the union. And a lot of them, Florida's has even more stuff listed in the including but not limited to. They have a whole, numbered list with a bunch of stuff. So I think this one has actually been, is trying to get the right balance. But it's any type of expenses related to election administration. That means conducting the election.
Mr. Secretary, is there anything in this bill that you feel would preclude any private organization from conducting these ancillary duties of a voter education program, voter registration drive, anything like that?
Mr. Chairman, no, the private organization could continue to do it. The issue is the co-opting of an official for, for a certain partisan purpose. That's what we're trying to get at.
Okay.
And that's what it intends.
Okay. Any further questions for the Secretary? Seeing none. Thank you very much for being here, Mr. Secretary. Is there anybody in the room that would like to testify on this bill? Seeing none, Ms. Childress, is there anyone online that would like to testify? All right. Thank you. Committee, what's your pleasure? Move to pass by Representative Pendergraft, seconded by Representative Haroldson. All right, page 1. Page 2,
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Sherwood.
thank you. I'm going to take a stab here at an amendment that I hope offers some clarity. So I'm on page 2, line 7 and 8. My amendment would be for this to read, the purpose of funding any type of expenses related to conducting elections, and then put a period there on line 8. So conducting elections, period. And then delete from administration, the rest of that line 8, the rest of the line 9, through programs on line 10. So then the sentence would read, the purpose of funding any type of expenses related to conducting elections, and then we're taking out that voter education, voter outreach, voter registration programs. So we're limiting it just to the election itself, and allowing flexibility for that voter outreach and education.
Okay, well done. I think you've made that pretty clear. All right, we have a motion on the table.
I'll second it just for conversation.
Okay, seconded by Haroldson.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Representative.
would you mind if we pulled the secretary back up just to have a conversation about this?
Mr. Secretary, please.
And just to clarify, it reads, starting on line 7, the purpose of funding any type of expenses related to conducting elections, and then strike, administration, including but not limited to voter education, voter outreach, or voter registration programs. Did I catch it?
You did. So is there a question for the Secretary?
Just kind of, is that net catching what we're looking at doing? Or do you believe that, that by eliminating that, we've cut too deep into the root?
Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, I do think we've cut into the root of the bill, so I oppose the amendment. I think let's try to, our office with the sponsor, and happy to bring in any members, including Representative Sherwood, I think we could try to take a stab at a committee of the whole amendment. But, I think removing that, especially with the legislative history, I think is getting to the intent of the bill pretty heavily. I think we can try to work on an amendment, but I think that's too far.
Follow up, Representative Haroldson. All right. Any further questions for the Secretary? Seeing none. All right. Any further comments on the motion? Seeing none. All those in favor of Sherwood's motion to amend, say aye. All those opposed? No? Okay, that is defeated. All right. Any other motions on page 2? Page 3? All right. Any further discussion on the bill? Seeing none. Ms. Childress, would you please take the roll?
Roll call vote on House Bill 228 do pass. Representative Allemand excused. Representative Angelos?
Aye.
Representative Haroldson? Aye. Representative Pendergraft?
Aye.
Representative Sherwood?
No.
Representative Smith?
Aye.
Chairman Bear?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, 5 aye, 1 no, 1 excused.
Change in choo-choo train drivers. Representative Bear, would you please present for us House Bill 294?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. This bill is another one, like you've seen come from me before, to simplify our cash flows and revenue flows. And so we currently have some flows that you'll find on page 16 of your data book. And what's happening is we have over the years determined that these federal mineral royalties would flow in certain directions into certain accounts in support of both the school foundation and in support of our general fund spending. And they've been going into the following accounts. You can see that at the bottom left, all of the FMRs in excess of 200 million at the bottom of page 16. 2/3 are going into the University of Wyoming. It's that first 8 million of that 2/3 goes into the University of Wyoming. Also, the remainder of that goes into the budget reserve account, and 1/3 goes into the school foundation program. And then when you go above that to 549.9 million, guess what? It kind of goes into the same place. You'll see it goes into the school foundation program, 40%, and budget reserve account, 60%. So we kind of, we're doing basically the same thing. It's 33.3% under 200, and then it goes to 40% for school foundation program. So a little bit of an increase on the school, and we eliminate the University of Wyoming. What this bill does is it eliminates everything below that arrow that is horizontal and then goes down to FMRs over 200 million. And what it does is it simply goes to two places if this bill should pass. And those two places are half of it going to the Common School Fund, Program Fund Reserve Account, and half goes to the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund Reserve Account. And so these are our checking account number 2 for each of those sides of the equation, and we're just simplifying it to 50% and 50%. And if we look at the bill, we can see that that's established in 9-4-601. On page 2, you can see we still keep the language of in excess of 200, so all those distributions on page 16 above that horizontal line remain, but we eliminate all of the language on subparagraph K, M, N, and we keep O and P. And O and P are the distributions that we're adding now. And so the language on page 2 continues to address that in other paragraphs. And then we have paragraph O, where we strike the language after 549,400,000, where for fiscal year 26, any revenue received under section A of this section in excess of that amount shall be distributed as follows. And so basically, we're saying anything in excess of that 549 million will be distributed, and we have a new paragraph P for the fiscal year 26 and each of the fiscal year thereafter. The revenue received under this section, subsection A, will be distributed in the following manner on line 18 on page 3. Then we get into Romanet number 1, 1/2 to the Common School Permanent Fund Reserve Account. And then on page 4, Romanet 2, 1/2 to the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund Reserve Account. So we are changing the accounts that it's going into. It's not going directly into the spending account, the big checkbook. It's going into the little checkbook where we tend to see less flows in and out, where we can invest it and get a higher rate of return. And if we look at the fiscal note, you'll see that there could be an increase or decrease of about $600,000 in 2026, a decrease in the budget reserve account, and an increase in the budget reserve account and a decrease in the school foundation program account. So that is the direct spending account, but you can see at $600,000, it's a very minimal change. Ultimately, this is just cleaning up what our data book is going to look like. We're getting rid of all these tips and dips and things like that. So I'll stand for any questions on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any questions from the committee?
Okay.
Seeing none, I see out there, Mr. Treasurer, would you care to comment on this?
I just walked in, I'm not sure which one you're talking about.
We're eliminating this and just going half here and half here.
Oh, I see.
Getting rid of all this.
Okay, all right, yeah. Yeah, well, that's along the same lines, I think, is what the Senate's doing, trying to simplify everything so it's easier to understand. We're all about simplification.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Haroldson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Bear, thank you for bringing these. Obviously, I think all of us, when we first got in here, went, how many coffee cans are there? And how many dip into what and dump into what? And so, obviously, I think we've seen a couple bills already. Here's a couple more, well, one more at least on elimination of an account or a change of distribution design. How many total coffee cans are we looking at eliminating this year? And really, ultimately, the goal is to get to kind of a savings checking, education savings check in state, correct? Is that like the ultimate goal that you're going after?
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Haroldson. Great question. There are over 600. If you look at, I think it's page 115 through 145 of your data book. And we're not really attacking a lot of those because those are trust funds where they're kind of off of our budget. And, you know, many of the cash flows in and out of those are established for particular earmarked things. And so to clean those up will be another heavy lift, and it'll be in the future if we do that. I think it'd be a great idea to bring those into some of the higher return accounts, but they're designed to be much like the 911 hotline trust fund. They're designed to be endowments that continue to fund those particular issues. My heartache with those 600 coffee cans is that the legislature basically doesn't look at those. And we never really prioritize. That spending is kind of off the budget. And if times get tight, we never touch those earmarked spending accounts, and it never comes into the prioritization discussion. And so maybe we're cutting something that we feel is a higher priority than what's out in those 600 accounts. That would be that issue. To this particular session, as the treasurer said, there's an account being eliminated over there. Yesterday, we, on committee of the whole, eliminated an account on the House side. So there's going to be some of these higher level accounts that we're dealing with this particular session, but we're not addressing those 600 coffee cans at this point. I would, since the question was asked, point out that much of the work that you're seeing in this session, both in the Senate and the House, was work developed by our staff here in Appropriations for this simplification effort back in, I think it was 2018 or sometime around that, but before my time, if you will. So kind of the design of cleanup and simplification, it's been worked on before. And so we're just taking that roadmap and trying to execute it in this session.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Follow up. Any other discussion? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, honorary chair, and to our chairman. I don't know that I had this in my notes here, but I'm looking at page 16 of our budget book, and currently there is a distribution of $8 million to the University of Wyoming. Apologies if you already addressed this, but could you, so we would be removing that distribution as part of this bill, is that correct?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sherwood, yeah, I did discuss it, but I didn't go into great depth on it, but you're absolutely right. We would be eliminating that $8 million. My thinking is that we have a block grant currently, which, you know, maybe that needs to be looked at as well, but that block grant is about $450 million for the biennium. So this $8 million, I think it's just one more tip that we don't need, and maybe we should include it if it's necessary. We could hear from the university as we go into the next budget session and ensure that that $8 million is part of the block grant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Follow up.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a worthy discussion to have as part of the block grant. The other thing I'm seeing is that their school foundation program account with this bill is part of this cleanup, which I do agree with the cleanup. I do agree with making this easier for us to read, for the public to read, that there is a revenue decrease to the school foundation program account. And I'm thinking big picture, is there a way that we could alleviate that decrease while still achieving this cleanup?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Sherwood, yeah, thank you for the question. As the fiscal note says, it's $600,000. My anticipation, because we put these into these reserve accounts, that we'll get a higher rate of return and fairly quickly, based on our actions in this session, if the bills that we've been working on pass, my anticipation is that we will have higher rate of returns to make up that money in a short order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any other questions? Seeing none, Ms. Childress, do you have anybody trying to invade us from the cyber world?
Mr. Vice Chair, Patrick Fleming is online. He might want to join us.
Please bring him in with us.
Mr. Fleming?
We'll come back and see if maybe we can reconnect there. In the meantime, please come forward, let us know who you are, who you represent, and you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, Boyd Brown, Wyoming Association of School Administrators Executive Officer. Not for or against it, understand the premise. The current concern that I would share is that with all of the reductions and bills that might reduce property taxes here that are in this session, knowing that that would reduce the school foundation account, this might be premature to not put that share not into the savings account, but into the checking account. Just a caution there that that might be something that you want to think about. And maybe in future years, if there's enough money going into the school foundation account, then you wouldn't have to worry about it. But you might, with everything that's going on, not knowing exactly how all those are going to work, you might make a structural deficit to the school foundation program. And with that, I'd take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Any questions for Mr. Brown? Seeing none, thank you, sir, for being here. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's worthy of addressing one of the concerns that was just brought up. This reserve account is not a permanent inviolate savings account. It is inviolate statutorily, but there are also cash flows coming out of that, and those earnings from these accounts do go through the savings account, flow right back into the school foundation program. So as we hit our 6X, which hopefully yesterday's effort began that, and then 7X, then any flows into those accounts is going to automatically lead to increases in the school foundation program. So it's not going to be locked down, if you will, that $600,000 change.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any other comments, questions? All right, is there anyone else in the room wishing to testify? Seeing none, we'll go back to the cyber world and see if Mr. Fleming has rejoined us. Ah, there you are, sir. Welcome to Appropriations. The floor is yours.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. I had a meeting with one of the bankers, but I'm sorry. Could you, what is are we on 191, sir?
We are in House Bill 294, the FMR redistribution amendments.
That is not a bill that I was going to comment on, sir, Mr. Chairman.
That's fine. It's good to see your face this morning anyway. Have a nice time. We'll be back whenever that's necessary.
Thank you, sir.
Anyone else wishing to opine on this? I like that word, opine, on this particular issue. Seeing none, we'll bring this back behind the dais. Committee, what's your pleasure? Moved by Representative Angelo, seconded by Representative Smith. Any discussion? Seeing none, let's walk through the bill. Any comments, changes on page 1? Page 2? Page 3? And page 4? Comments, questions on the fiscal note? Seeing none, any other comments before we go to the vote? Ms. Childress, would you please take the roll?
Roll call vote, House Bill 294, do pass. Representative Allemand excused. Representative Angelos? Aye. Representative Bear? Aye. Representative Harrelson?
Aye.
Representative Pendergraft?
Aye.
Representative Sherwood?
No.
Representative Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Vice Chair, 5 aye, 1 no, 1 excused.
Thank you. That one has passed Committee of Appropriations. Mr. Chairman, welcome back. Please lead us through House Bill 291.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and looking at the time, I will be as brief as I can. I don't know if we'll make it all the way through, depending on your public comment on this one, but we can certainly continue in the next meeting if need be. But this, I bring you House Bill 291, Financial Institution Discrimination, and this particular bill is meant to encapsulate rules that the Secretary of State has attempted to promulgate in the past. And I'll just quickly walk you through the bill and give you the crux of it, and I'll let the Secretary of State opine on what he thinks can be established here. But basically, the purpose of the bill is to address those banks that are registered agents here within the state of Wyoming, registered with the Secretary of State, and maintaining a list of those banks that use ESG discrimination against any entity within the state of Wyoming. And you'll see, as you go through the bill, definitions on page 2, clear through page 3, page 4, and then in page 5, we begin to get into the actual action of the bill, if you will. And you'll see on line 11, the Secretary of State shall prepare and maintain a list of financial institutions that engage in a boycott of energy companies. So it's very specific. This is energy companies. And you'll recall we passed a bill a few years ago that dealt with this issue in regards to gun manufacturers and gun companies within the state. The list prepared under this subsection shall be known as the Restricted Financial Institution List. I'll go back to that gun comment. What we stated there was that none of the state entities could do business with those banks. The Secretary of State on line 17 shall submit a copy of the Restricted Financial Institution List to the Board of Deposits, the President of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House. And upon affirmative vote by the Board of Deposits, the Secretary of State shall publicly post the Restricted Financial Institution List on the Secretary of State's website. On page 6, you'll see a citation to this article and a brief summary. The purposes of the Restricted Financial Institution List shall appear at the top of the Restricted Financial Institution List, so we're prescribing exactly how it will be on that site, including a statement that inclusion on the Restricted Financial Institution List is neither an indication of unsafe or unsound operating conditions of any financial institution, nor an indication of any risk to consumer deposits. The Secretary of State shall update the Restricted Financial Institutions List annually, or more often as the Secretary of State considers necessary. Notice to the financial institution. So if they're going to be on the list, we want to notify them not later than 45 days before, including a financial institution on the Restricted Financial Institution List. The Secretary of State shall send a written notice to the institution containing the following information. That the Secretary of State determined the financial institution is restricted, that the financial institution will be placed on the list 45 days And within 30 days after the receipt of the written notice, the restricted financial institution demonstrates that it is not engaged in a boycott of energy companies, that restricted financial institution list is published on the Secretary of State's official website, that the institution's replacement or placement on the restricted financial list may render the institution ineligible to enter into or renew banking contracts with the state of Wyoming. After a restricted financial institution's inclusion on the list, on page 8, the Secretary shall remove the institution from the restricted financial institution list if the institution demonstrates that it has ceased all activity that boycotts energy companies. And then we have in 1310-404, sources of information. On page 9, 1310-405, restricted financial institutions, the state treasurer and the state auditor shall refuse to enter into new banking contract or renew an existing contract with that financial institution. And in subparagraph B, the state treasurer and state auditor shall require as a term of any banking contract an agreement by the financial institution not to engage in a boycott of energy companies for duration of the contract. So new contracts would have language in them that address this particular statute if it should pass. And then we have in definitions, take action that is intended to penalize, inflict economic harm, or on or limit commercial relations with a company. And then on page 11, the effective date is July 1st of 2025. And there is no fiscal impact determinable, but this could impact banks that we do business with in the state. So there could be transfers, things like that, that have to happen, and some management of funds should a bank end up on this list.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very quickly, the last word on page 11 is person. I'm assuming that is the same definition of person that we often deal with that include certain entities.
Chairman Pendergraft, yes, that would be accurate. Thank you. And
Thank you,
I'll stand
Mr.
for
Chairman.
any further questions.
Committee, any questions? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you. I am unfamiliar with the Board of Deposits, and how often do they meet?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Sherwood, I'm going to have to phone a friend on that one as well, so it's not something that I'm familiar with. So the treasurer I just overheard say.
Mr. Treasurer, if you would care to answer that for us?
We meet 4
Mr. Treasurer, yeah, please use the microphone so anybody online can hear.
Okay, this is State Treasurer Kurt Meyer, Mr. Chairman. We meet 4 times a year as a Board of Deposits to determine TDOA program participation as time deposit open accounts. And essentially, we allow up to 5% of the deposits to be of the banks, of the member banks. That's the amount that determines how much money we will allow banks that are approved to have a proportion of that based on the deposits that they have. So we will meet sometimes more often than that if we have new banks that are coming into the system so that they're approved. But we will at least meet 4 times a year to determine the interest rate in which those banks have to pay back to the state.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Follow-up?
I do have a follow-up, Mr. Treasurer. Thank you for being here with us this morning. Who is on the Board of Deposits? Are those appointed positions? Are those elected positions? Would you opine, please?
Yes,
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Treasurer.
It's the top 5 elected officials that are on the Board of Deposits. Essentially, the state treasurer is the chairman of the Board of Deposits. And so we basically place those things on the SLIB board agenda, and that's how they get on there.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Any other questions? Seeing none, is there, Mr. Secretary, would you care to? Okay. Mr. Treasurer,
What's that? Do I have any questions?
did you have anything to add?
Oh, I
Did
just.
you
some-
want to opine?
Yeah, I guess,
291.
I'm curious as to what problem that we're seeking to resolve here. It's hard to determine the differences between a boycott and a business decision by a bank. I would say 85 or 90% of the banks in Wyoming don't do any energy loans. And that's because their business is making loans for washing machines, dryers, second mortgages, houses, and car loans, and different personal loans. So, necessarily they're not boycotting, they're just making a business decision. And so I'd like to, basically know what the difference is between a boycott, which means they are not, to me, it means they're not doing any energy business, and a business decision to basically stay within their lane and their area of expertise.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Mr. Chairman, would you care to respond?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, on page 2, line 19, we define boycott of an energy company means a financial institution that, without a reasonable business or financial purpose, discriminates against an energy company because the energy company, and then you'll see definitions on page 3, engages in the exploration, production, use, transportation, sale, or manufacturing of fossil fuel energy, engages in an exploration, production, use, so on and so forth, or does business with a company that engages in those activities. So I think it's incumbent upon us to determine, are they discriminating based on what those activities are, or is it a reasonable business decision? And I think the treasurer points out that, some of these smaller banks, it's a reasonable business decision not to get into some of those riskier businesses. And if they have a loan board that made that decision based on business metrics, if you will, then I think they would have a very good leg to stand on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any further comments? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you so much. Treasurer, I'm wondering if you could share with me, and estimates are fine, on page 2, lines 14, 15, 16, it talks about the definition of a banking contract, and that agreement between the state treasurer, the state auditor, and financial institutions. I assume these are financial institutions within the state of Wyoming. Do we know how many financial institutions we have agreements with or contracts with now, and how many of those contracts may be impacted by this policy?
Yeah.
Mr. Treasurer.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think there's two different types of contracts that we enter into. The most, I think, the TDOA program, I'm not exactly sure how many banks we have in the state. I'd have to look at the list, but there's 40 or 50 banks that I think that are in the TDOA program. But that is basically from memory, but I can tell you exactly how many banks they are. We'll get that for you, their names, and have the report that we have quarterly. It'll be, how many banks are eligible, how many banks participate, the amount which they do participate, and the collateral that they have for the loans that we make on deposit for the deposits. So you'll get that whole thing. I'll go ahead and supply that to the committee. The biggest area where this really affects us, and to the extent that I really don't understand the area expertise at the Secretary of State's office, who is primarily elections and basically LLCs and some licensing, have to make the determination that any of these banks are boycotting or their financial state of anything. It's really, to me, it's an area that you have some lines where people stay on their lines, and this particular bill is having the Secretary of State get into my business and get into the auditor's business. So that's something that I think those lines are definitely crossed in this. Now, getting back to the areas of where we have operational custody banks. That's Wells Fargo and JP Morgan, which is our custody bank. I can tell you we redid our contract with JP Morgan just a couple of years ago. And we looked at every potential bank that could be a custody bank. And every one of them, from our perspective, had serious ESG problems. In fact, the only 3 banks in the world that did not have ESG problems that would check the ESG you're okay box was 2 in China that had 2 ESG problems, or China, and 1 in Japan. And we weren't going to go outside of the country, to satisfy checking the box on ESG. But what we have done is that we have implemented very strong proxy voting, and I think the different things that we've done with SOF and making these banks understand that they should be, I think, more ESG, I guess, friendly from the values in basically developing our natural resources in the state. They've made that pivot, and they've made that pivot for a lot of different areas. I think the biggest reason was that the banks decided that they didn't have to essentially bank energy concerns was back when basically the oil price went negative on the board. And we were getting less than $40 a barrel here. And when that market change went, it basically, I had about $1.5 million in leases that I was going to have, and the guy goes back to try to get a bank loan, and the oil goes down precipitously, and essentially that basically stopped everything in its tracks, because that was a business decision. But the banks took it as an opportunity to pivot and try to get some loans on, I would say, the green bad deal, from my perspective, and that's where they're at. Where we're at today is that, oil prices are higher, it's easier to drill, and essentially one of the banks that signed on to the carbon-free 20 by 50 did a deal with us in the Powder River Basin on a natural gas pipeline. That was Goldman Sachs. And they had their best year because they got back into the energy business because it was profitable again. So, from our perspective, the Secretary of State's office doesn't employ a full-time financial consultant like we do. They don't have the acumen within their shop to make any financial decisions about whether or not any of these banks are necessarily boycotting. And I believe if you really drill down into it, is that there's ESG problems in practically a lot of different contracts that exist in the state. And I don't have the level of, I guess I'd say, comfort to let some other elected official whose primary duties are elections, or our primary duties in our office, in the auditor's office, is accounting for every red cent that the state has and making 30% of the profit or revenue that we need to run the state. It just does not exist in this Secretary of State's office, nor did it exist in any previous Secretary of State's office. And so crossing this line to us is a direct affront in what happened in years past, where from the prior chairman of Appropriations essentially had a bill that was going to have our chief operating officer reside within the Office of State Lands and tell my employees what to do. That was a budget amendment.
Mr. Treasurer, I think that you have adequately made your point, and I would like to continue, please.
Well, I got a lot more to say about this one.
Was there a follow-up? Thank you. I would like to hear if there's anyone online. Yes. Hang on, Ms. Secretary. We'll get there. I'd kind of like to round out the case from the Treasurer's Department first. Mr. Sertain. Oh, man. Please speak to us from the treasurer's office.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. It's Patrick Fleming, CIO from the Treasurer's Office. And I would like to just kind of go into a little bit more of a detail on what the Treasurer is talking about and how the area of expertise to understand this is extremely difficult. So just my background, I ran a commodity trading book for a hedge fund. I taught energy trading and hedging at the University of Wyoming. This is an area that I'm very, very well versed in. When you're looking at making loans to energy companies, there's many factors that go into it. One of the big things is understanding the curve of the oil contracts, whether or not you're above or below cost of production, whether the curve is in contango or backwardation is the terms. So if you're not able to hedge out those costs, you're not going to make the loan. We talked about the volatility of oil. The treasurer had mentioned, in April of 2020, when oil traded at minus 38. Our energy revenue in the state, it's the number one most volatile revenue source that we have. It has a 50 to 60% volatility. Banks and large institutions, it is extremely difficult to do. So when you're looking at this and having somebody who doesn't, whether it's a current secretary or a future secretary, it's just not in their wheelhouse to understand the nuances that go into this. And of course, they're going to say, well, no, we're not, doing anything different. The bank is going to say that. And then it's a unilateral decision on one person who doesn't have that expertise to make that decision and understand. There's capital adequacy rules that these banks have. They have to understand how much capital adequacy or whether they're using the capital to this source of lending that other institutions might be more profitable in other areas. So they switch around this all the time. So whether or not it's because of the cost of oil or whether there's other sources that are more profitable, it is all over the board. Unless you really delve into understanding what these people are doing, it's extremely difficult to do. The other point on this is many of these large institutions, as the treasurer mentioned, like if JP Morgan was put on the list, what if you had a Secretary of State who said, well, I have a problem with the treasurer and I'm going to put JP Morgan on this list? That would shut down our business. We would not be able to do it. It's just very, very problematic from numerous issues. If these large institutions, if they were put on the list, I think it would actually potentially have a negative impact because they look at it and say, the amount of money that they make for doing this in Wyoming is negligible. There's over 300 rigs in the Permian Basin who has a very low cost of capital. They loan all the time in the Permian. Our DJ and Niobrara Basin has 16 total rigs. There's only 9 in that basin. They would sit there and go, well, instead of being on this list, I'm just going to not lend at all to the state of Wyoming and be able to do all these other businesses. So there's numerous problems from an investment perspective with this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fleming. I apologize for slipping on your name earlier. Any questions for Mr. Fleming from the committee? Seeing none, thank you, sir, for being here. All right, we have heard from the Treasurer's Office. At this time, I would like to ask the Secretary of State to come forward, and please, sir, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think in light of some of the comments that have been made, I would really like to start with what this bill does and what it does not do. And I think it's very important in light of House Bill 80 and some of the things that in my view were inaccurate said by the Treasurer's Office about that bill to lay out what this bill does and what it does not do. First of all, this bill does not have to do with investments. This has to do with what banks the state of Wyoming is going to bank with. Now, you'll remember in 2018, August 10, 2018, 10 days before the primary election, our current governor, who was treasurer at the time, famously announced in a press release and was lauded by the media at the time for announcing that he was going to debank BNP Paribas and that Wyoming was no longer going to bank with them because of their anti-oil and gas activities. 10 days before the primary election, the media was all in on it. And this authority is already with the state treasurer. They can already decide to debank. Now, they've decided not to do any further, even though the treasurer appeared to just say that he thinks all but 3 banks on the list are engaged in ESG. Now, that's different from a boycott of oil and gas. The definition of a boycott is a financial institution that without a reasonable business or financial purpose discriminates against an energy company because the company engages in the exploration, production, use, transportation, sale, or manufacturing of fossil fuel-based energy. And then there's 2 other things that they can't discriminate on. So it's without a reasonable business or financial purpose. So when he says that there's banks that aren't lending to oil and gas companies and that automatically puts them on the exclusion list, that's not what the bill says. The bill also says that we don't have the exclusive authority over this question. It says that the Board of Deposits, which is the State Loan and Investment Board, has to vote on the list for it to go into effect. And the Board of Deposits is 9-4-801. In answer to that question earlier, it says the State Loan and Investment Board is established as and shall perform the duties of the Board of Deposits. The governor is the chairman of the board. State treasurer is the secretary of the board. And it says the Board of Deposits shall meet quarterly each year or at any other time upon the call of the chairman. The board shall designate banks within this state eligible as state depositories for the purpose of receiving on-deposit funds of this state. So this just has to do with where we're depositing public monies. So I just want to start out here and debunk some of the false things that have been said. Now, in terms of what I view as the pejorative statements of the Treasurer's Office, that we don't have the expertise in the Secretary of State's office to engage in this, we register every single LLC in the state. And it's often been said, this is the Chief of Staff of the Governor's Office who said it, that we're considered sort of the chief business liaison of the state. And our office has also taken an interest in taking on boycotts, companies that are boycotting energy businesses. Now, the treasurer can bring any motion he
Mr.
wants
Secretary.
to the Board of Deposit.
Mr. Secretary,
Yeah.
I would like to confine the comments to the specifics of the bill. What I would like to avoid is a back and forth between departments, between officers, that probably is not going to serve the purpose of the committee at this time.
Right. Well,
So
that's fine.
Please confine your remarks
Mr.
to
Chairman,
exactly
thank
what
you.
the bill does. And that having been said, are there any questions for the secretary from the committee? Seeing none, I also see the auditor there. Madam Auditor, would you care to chime in on this?
Mr. Chairman, I feel like the middle child. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm going to speak a little bit more to the construction of the bill as opposed to the policy decision to be made by you all. A lot of the testimony related to approved state depositories, in other words, where governments, where the Board of Deposits says it's okay for governments to put their money. And I think there's been much testimony about that. I don't know that the definition of banking contract, I don't think that includes state depositories. We don't have contracts with those approved state depositories. Those are your local circuit courts, et cetera, and some of your local governments. So I just want to point that out, that I think maybe what folks are talking about, I'm not sure if that meets the definition of banking contract or not. My other comment, Mr. Chairman, is my office's inclusion in this bill, and I'm okay either way, so I'm not concerned about my operations. I'm not sure if I have any contracts that meet that definition to your intent. I don't have any control of cash or deposit money. Now, what my office does do, Mr. Chairman, is we have one zero-cost contract to manage the state's purchasing card program. So we contract with a bank. It is not a Wyoming bank. Wyoming banks don't do this, I believe, or not at this level, to provide purchasing cards to all state agencies. The reason I say it's not a Wyoming bank and I don't think they have the capability is we recently put out a robust request for proposal process and received no applications from anyone other than large banks. My final comment would be, so my inclusion in there, if you consider something like that a banking contract, that's fine. I don't have any concerns about that contract. If the intent is to include all state agencies from banking with such entities, there are other agencies that do have banking contracts that would meet the definition that you have in this bill. So, Mr. Chairman, again, not so much getting into the policy question, but just, like I said, there's been a lot of talk about depositories, and I don't think this bill affects them the way that's currently worded as banking contract.
Thank you, Madam Auditor. Are there any questions? Seeing none, Mr. Treasurer, I will recognize and ask you to please confine.
From being personal, yeah. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking at, but there was a statement that said this doesn't affect investments, and I say there was an assertion that this doesn't affect investments. And looking at the page 1, the banking contract, it's a contract entered into by the state treasurer in a financial institution to provide banking services to the state. That's where I see it looks exactly at me or any other political subdivision, which means any city, town, the 600 different accounts or whatever that we have, a lot of them have, banking relationships. And so this would affect not only me, but it would affect every one of them. And I don't know if there's any areas in here that says that each one of these institutions that use banking services, political subdivisions, are going to be notified that, hey, you have to get rid of your bank. That's something that I'd ask. But I think this is directly, we need a custody bank. That's a service that basically we have, and we have had the bank that does most of the business in the state, which is another bank here. And so looking at it, I think this directly affects our ability to have custody service. And it's not by an officer that's making this decision. That's an officer of the State Board of Deposits. That's the governor and myself. Those are the officers of that board. Now, the other SLIB members are members of that board, but essentially the business of that board should be conducted by the officers, not another board member that wants to insert himself statutorily into the day-to-day business of the Board of Deposits. That's my opinion, that it essentially crosses lines that I made that before. As to the part over here, and let me get to the page about attestation, I believe. If I can find that, where it says that that essentially a bank can attest that they aren't boycotting. We require a annual attestation by all the folks that are in the TDAO program about whether they follow, some of these ESG things that we're so concerned about. And it'd be just as simple to just, because we're doing it already, is to put a question in there with the check marks is, do you boycott energy? With the definitions that are in that bill. And I think that checks the box as to any of those people. We're very, happy to do what we're already doing, but broaden that out a little bit to include boycotting energy companies. I think the fine points of actually figuring out whether or not a company will or will not be subject to this is kind of restricted from the standpoint that there's a limitation about what you can actually get from these companies, because they can say, well, all this is privileged information. And so if they assert that all of this information, that's something that I'm assuming that there's going to be a due diligence, and that the Secretary of State's office is going to have to, make a.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer, for
Yeah.
making those concerns known. At this point, is there any other public
I'd like to make a
comment?
couple comments here, Mr. Chairman.
I'll come back to you, Mr. Secretary.
Okay, thank you.
Sir, please have a seat, introduce yourself, and share with us what you have to share.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jeremiah Bishop, I'm the State Banking Commissioner and the head of the Division of Banking. I enforce and administer Title 13. I'm not going to speak to the intent of this bill too much. I just more of the technicalities of how this is drafted. One technical amendment, if this bill stays as written, is on page 4, lines 5 and 6. The definition of financial institution refers to Wyoming Statute 1310-301A, Romanet 3. I believe that should be Romanet 9. Romanet 3 is the definition of bank holding company, and Romanet 9 is the definition of financial institution as it relates to Title 13. So that's just a technical change if this stays as written. Another, I guess, more conceptual amendment I would propose is removing this from Title 13 entirely and moving it to Title 9. So Title 13 relates to mostly state chartered banks in Wyoming. That's why I administer it. Title 9, specifically Chapter 4, Article 8, deals with state funds and banks. And I think moving it there would actually better align with the sponsor's intent of this bill. Under Title 13, where it stays right now, the definition of bank excludes national banks. So we only have 21 state chartered banks in Wyoming that have to comply with Title 13. Other out-of-state chartered banks that are chartered in different states that are doing business here have to sometimes comply with Title 13. My understanding is the intent is to cover all banks that deal with the 3 agencies that have spoken before. And specifically, I think it's a Title 94803A has a different definition of bank, which relates to those depositories that the state treasurer can invest in. And it's any bank chartered under the laws of the United States or under the law of any state if the bank is conducting business in Wyoming. So as it stays right now, if it stays in Title 13, this would not apply to any national banks, which is most likely the ones that I think you would want this to apply to. If you were to somehow tie it to Title 9, that definition, I think it works a lot better towards the intent. The other reason to moving it out of Title 9 is there's nothing in this bill that restricts banks from doing anything. There's nothing that directs my office to enforce anything. So there's nothing for me to do with this bill, with it being in Title 13. So I think that's more of a technical change, but I think it would be a good amendment to better align with the definitions under other areas of state law that would actually better align with the the sponsor's intent. With that was quite, stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you. Maybe it's a little bit risky, but I'm going to offer Secretary a last bite at the offer.
Not risky. It's truth, but appreciate it. Representative Pendergraft, appreciate comments on the bill. I would just say that I think we can work on amendments to clarify that custodian banks are not necessarily subject to this, but this has to do with state deposits. And that's what I think the intent of this is doing. And I think we have to ask ourselves, do we really want to deposit Wyoming state money with banking institutions that are actively boycotting oil and gas companies? That's the question. And I think the answer to that is no. I think it's been no for some time. I think other officers have said it was no, and I think that's all we're trying to effectuate. I haven't asked for this in any way, but I'm happy to go ahead and implement the bill if it's the will of the legislature. And I certainly am supportive of us only banking with institutions that are in alignment with profit maximization, because that's what this is about, is profit maximization. And trying to turn the definition, as I'm afraid happened on House Bill 80, the whole point is that this political behavior is not profit maximizing. It's the opposite of what has been alleged out there in the discussion on House Bill 80. When you engage in a boycott of an industry that is profit maximizing, that facially goes against what it means to be a fiduciary. And the other thing our office does is we regulate every single broker-dealer, investment advisor in this state. And that's why we also have the expertise, because that's what we do, is we evaluate whether, and that was in line with the rulemaking we did on investment advisors and broker-dealers, that they would have to pursue only profit maximizing activity.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you all for your testimony. Is there any other public comment? Please come forward, introduce yourself, and share with us what you have.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Scott Meyer on behalf of the Wyoming Bankers Association. I sure cleaned out the table real fast. I appreciate the opportunity to come and discuss this bill. I think the commissioner, banking commissioner, did a pretty fine job of talking about the Title 13 through 9, so I won't go through any of that. As you probably know, or maybe you're aware of, the fact that our banks, because of the risk assessment that they have to do on everything they do, they're pretty doggone conservative. You won't, and with that being said, then we appreciate what you're trying to do here. But understand that our Wyoming community banks, they don't debank or anything with any industry ever. Those banks literally look at this and say, what is it with every industry, with every loan? What expertise do we have? What ability do we have to deal with this stuff? And if we can't bank somebody with reasonable assurance that we know what even we're doing, we don't bank them. That's a business decision. That's not boycotting. That's not anything else. We have we have banks that do energy stuff, but we have banks that don't bank the energy industry because they don't have the expertise to do that. The other thing is that when we're dealing with political subdivisions, whether you're talking about the state, the county, the city, the cemetery district, whatever, depending on what is being asked of it, a lot of banks don't even have enough securities to pledge, so they can't meet these needs. And I think Auditor Racines made that point perfectly clear, that there are some banks that don't do this because it's just not in their wheelhouse. My concerns with this bill, though, is discussing this list. Who makes that determination? And I think that we have the same position as the Treasurer's Office, that the people that are putting this list, even though they're going to take it to the Board of Deposits, what qualifications do they have to make that kind of determination? And I don't think that that really is in their wheelhouse. They don't have the expertise. That makes us a little bit suspect of how this is going. And then the question is, what's a reasonable basis? And I'm not sure there's any definition of that other than what's in the statute there or in the bill. But you look at it, that's what, based on publications, based on other comments. I'm not sure. What this seems to me is that if they make a determination, all of a sudden you're guilty until proven innocent, and that seems awful difficult. A lot of our banks just don't have the expertise to deal with some of these things, and they don't. But I don't want to have my banks being put onto some list. The other thing is, I'm not sure who's going to be in charge of the fact that if one person in some place like the SOS has the power to publish that bank's name, are they able to handle the fallout that should permanently damage that bank if they're wrong? And that's our Wyoming community banks. That's the ones that are financing the businesses down the street, the agricultural industry and the energy industry. This appeal, there's not really an appeal process in this. And if any of you were paying attention to the prior administration in DC and the CFPB, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and their director, this is what it looks like. We're having handed down heavy regulation over something that your Wyoming community banks aren't a part of, and yet we're going to be sucked into this. I would ask that if you looked at the bill, I would ask that you consider an amendment. If I look at page 8, and we go down to the bottom of page 8, and Romanet 2 talks about some of the things that are attestation that is not engaged in a boycott of energy. What happens? You have in there that statements by financial institutions governing body, fine, but executive director of a financial institution or any other officer or employee, people have the right of freedom of speech. They may say something. That doesn't necessarily reflect on the bank, but they do that. So my suggestion is to delete that in an executive director or any other officer, that the rest of that section down there, I would suggest that we delete that. Because you're going to subject these folks to something that they have no business in being subjected to. With that, Mr. Chairman, I certainly stand for any questions.
Thank you, sir. Are there any questions for Mr. Meyer? If not, I did have one. You mentioned an appeals process. Where, sir, would you include that? How would you see that process effective in this?
Mr. Chairman, my suggestion would be that if you're going to have an appeals process, it should be somewhere right after where you start talking about, here's who's going to put somebody on the list, and we're going to submit that. But before that happens, the bank ought to know what they're on that list and how I would suggest that they somehow appeal that. And it has to be somebody other than the person putting on that list. So maybe it would be the Board of Deposits or something before that gets out of hand, because there may be complete vindictive things, or there may be just a misunderstanding, or there could be just an error in how they figure out things. I don't know, but that needs to have some kind of an ability for the banks to say, that's not what we're doing. We just don't bank that industry.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Any other public comment? Seeing none, we'll close public comment. Move this back behind the dais. Committee, what's your pleasure? Is there a second? Without a second, apparently this dies right here. Barring any other business, we are adjourned.